Good evening, and welcome back to Gentle Historian Medieval Life, where history drifts softly between fact and imagination, and where we explore how people loved, lived, and occasionally regretted both. Tonight, we step into the complicated, muddy, and often hilarious world of medieval romance, a time when finding love was less about fluttering hearts and more about surviving taxes, plagues, and priests. So you think modern dating is difficult? Try doing it while your parents negotiate how many cows you're worth, and the village priest reads your love letters for heresy. In the Middle Ages, love wasn't a hobby. It was a social risk. The word dating didn't even exist. Nobody asked, "Do you want to grab a drink?" Because drinks were ale shared from the same bucket and everyone in town was already watching. Courtship back then wasn't about finding a soulmate. It was about finding someone whose family could pay the dowry and who had at least most of their teeth. A good match wasn't measured by chemistry, but by livestock and the number of acres that came with it. It's easy to laugh at now, but for medieval people, love was a dangerous luxury. To fall in love before marriage could ruin your family's alliances. To fall in love after marriage was basically a miracle. And yet, despite all the rules humans did, what humans always do, they flirted, they lied, they wrote bad poetry, and they hoped. Imagine standing in a drafty stone hall, wearing too many layers, trying to make eye contact without being accused of witchcraft. Imagine expressing your feelings through carved spoons and ribbons, because words could get you excommunicated. Romance back then was an obstacle course built by the church, navigated by poets, and occasionally destroyed by goats. Still, people found ways. Peasants flirted while carrying buckets to the well. Knights wrote verses to women they couldn't touch. Noblewomen exchanged embroidered sleeves like ancient text messages. Every glance, every gift, every whispered word was both a rebellion and a risk. There's something strangely beautiful in that love, surviving in a world that tried so hard to control it. Tonight, we'll wander through the feasts, the farms, and the forbidden letters of the medieval heart. We'll meet peasants who courted with turnips instead of roses, knights who pined for married ladies, and priests who invented entire manuals warning against improper smiling. We'll see how marriage was a transaction courtship, was a group activity, and love somehow still bloomed like a stubborn weed in a stone courtyard. So dim the lights, take a deep breath, and settle in. Let the candlelight flicker in your mind as we travel back to an age when romance smelled faintly of hay and holy water. This is the story of how love survived the Middle Ages, clumsy, censored, but somehow still human. If you enjoy wandering gently through forgotten corners of history, remember to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Now close your eyes if you'd like, and let's begin our quiet journey into the strange, tender, and occasionally ridiculous world of medieval love. Love was a transaction and a hope. If you could open a medieval heart, you wouldn't just find butterflies. You'd find a ledger. Romance in the Middle Ages lived under three watchful guardians: survival, kinship, and the sacred. Survival asked, "Can this household feed itself through winter?" Kinship asked, "Does this union strengthen our people?" And the sacred, embodied by a church bell that tolled over every field and alley, asked, "Is this lawful, blessed, and properly?" Announced 3 Sundays in a row. Between those questions, the fluttering heart did its best to keep a rhythm. Start with survival. Because sentiment on an empty stomach is simply poetry performed to a rumbling drum. A medieval household was a small economic engine. Animals, tools, seed hands. Marriage didn't merely combine 2 souls. It merged 2 labor forces. A wife meant bread-baked milk, churned children minded a second pair of hands at shearing time. A husband meant plowing strength, roof mending legal standing at market, a shoulder against wolves, four-legged sometimes two. Set aside perfumes and lutes. The most romantic gift in many villages was a serviceable plowshare and a roof that didn't leak over the bed. Dowry and bride price floated through this world like twin coins in the same purse. In some places, a bride came with linens, a chest, a cow, a handful of coins if fortune smiled. Elsewhere, the groom's family paid the bride's kin to compensate for her labor, leaving their fire. Either way, value moved because a person was moving, and the village wanted the math to remain balanced. It sounds cold, but in a world of narrow margins, it was a kind of tenderness. Families shoring up a young couple against famine with cloth pots and animals that gave more animals. Love, if it came, could arrive later with the bread. Kinship sat next to survival at the head of the table. Peasant families scanned hedgerows and field lines the way nobles scanned border maps. A marriage that joined neighboring strips might turn two awkward slivers of land into something plowable without a week of zigzags. A union between two Thatcher families could mean guaranteed roofs for cousins and cousins' cousins. Gossip wasn't just entertainment, it was due diligence. Is he sober? Does she keep a tidy yard? Do their hens actually lay? This was linked in with geese. For the nobility, kinship wore velvet and spoke heraldry. Children were betrothed to redraw maps without a single sword unsheathed. A wedding could move mountains, or at least a mountain pass. It also moved children into adulthood on someone else's schedule. Your heart might quicken for the falconer's apprentice, but your father saw a dowry large enough to buy a better mill share and attempted not to notice your size. In this sense, a medieval matchmaker was less Cupid and more civil engineer. Then came the sacred. If survival and kinship counted goats and fields, the church counted degrees of cousinhood. From the 12th century onward, marriage in Latin Christendom hardened into a sacrament in canon law drafted by men with tidy handwriting and long memories declared that mutual consent made a real marriage. A radical kindness. Two people could say, "I take you" in the present tense, and technically be Wednesday. But the same law wrapped that tenderness in fences. You could not marry too close in blood. You should publish your bans so neighbors could object. He's already promised elsewhere, and you should do it before a priest if you wanted peace. Later, the village liked ceremonies because the village wanted clarity. Hence the bans 3 Sundays with your name sung into the rafters so any entanglements could flutter down like startled pigeons. If someone cleared a cough in the second pew and said delicately that the groom had sworn himself to Agnes last harvest under the oak after too much ale, well, better to untie the knot now than at the church porch with a crowd and a scandal. Consent was queen, but community was chaperone. Betrothal and marriage lived closer together than many think. There were promises for the future, "I will take you," and promises in the present, "I take you." And in the fog between them, couples sometimes found themselves arguing years later about which words they'd used, what they'd meant, and who had been sober enough to count syllables. Witnesses mattered. So did tokens, a ring, a knife, a belt, a coin. The church preferred the tidy order of vows in daylight with a priest, but life had its own calendar. Some couples married hand-to-hand on a threshold at dusk. Some made vows in a field because someone's father had a temper and someone else's mother had a sharper one. The parish tried to sweep all these knots into the same broom closet, bless them, and pin their names in the margins of a register where the ink didn't always hold. Age is one of the most misunderstood shadows in this hallway. Nobles sometimes married young for alliance. Yes, that was the point of using children as chess pieces. But for most people, marriage waited until work made a household possible. A man wanted tools and a plot. A woman wanted linen, a cow, a chest. Time was a dowry too. People married when they could not, when a modern chart expects them to. The chaperone you met in the intro, let's call her Aunt Margaret, knitting with a face like judgment, didn't hover only because of temptation. She hovered because the village trusted eyes over rumors. A courtship was a public thing. Supervised walks, talk on a bench, 2 ells apart. A cousin, listening accidentally, of course. Reputation was wealth. Kisses spent unwisely were like coins lost in a hedge and still counted against you at market. Even letters were public objects in practice. Literacy lived unevenly, but where it lived, it learned to whisper. Lovers wrote in metaphors so dense they would survive amongst curiosity. Souls as deer in forests, hearts as lit tapers, longing folded like altar cloth. A signature could ruin you. A smear of beeswax perfume could be recognized at 10 paces. Safer sometimes to send a token than a sentence. A ribbon snipped from a sleeve. A glove pinned openly where everyone could pretend not to notice. Economics kept a running commentary. A household looked outward for credit and inward for stamina. Bread tasted of the year's luck. When fodder ran low, tempers did too. Love wore work clothes. She who made a good pottage and he who mended a wheel straight were sex symbols of a very practical kind. People didn't list humor at the top of their hopes, but they noticed it. Laughter at the hearth was a luxury like honey you remembered it long after. The law, earthly and ecclesiastical, wrapped marriage with rights and obligations, a woven rope that could snag. There was the conjugal debt, a polite term for the idea that spouses owed each other bodily kindness at reasonable intervals. There was dowry law, what portion of a wife's goods remained hers, what portion safeguarded for her if he died or failed at virtue. A widow might, with luck and good neighbors, reclaim her chest and cow and set up a small sovereignty of her own, a brief reign of independence before a second marriage. Or a long widowhood turned the village's pity into a fence around her door. Not all unions began without affection. Not all ended without it. Many did what human hearts have always done. They warmed by use. The first winter taught each other's habits. The first illness taught each other's gentleness. The first birth taught both the size of risk. Love throttled early by strategy. Sometimes crept back later with breadcrumbs and soft hands, and found 2 people too busy to notice until one paused and said, "You're kinder than I guessed," and the other answered, "You snore like a brewery." But yes, the village policed what it blessed. There was charivari for men who beat wives, skimmington rides for adulterers, public mockery for those who married too soon after a funeral. The line between justice and cruelty braided tightly. A community's conscience was not always kind. But those raucous nights announced communal norms in a language of pans and ladles banged together in rhymes you wouldn't teach a child. In their own raw way, they said marriage matters here. You can see how courtly love our later chapters hazard of knights who adore ladies from distances measured in psalms grew from this soil of rules. If marriage was a contract longing needed a stage elsewhere. So nobles invented one, a theater of manners and songs, where passion could breathe without burning the legal house down. Meanwhile, in the village, a different kind of poetry stayed closer to the earth, the way a man lifted a bucket from a woman's yoke, without being asked, the way a woman set an extra onion aside for a neighbor's thin stew. In a world with few private rooms, privacy lay in gestures. And all the while, the church kept time. Priests announced, bands heard confessions that mixed desire with drought, and gave counsel in voices that tried to be both truthful and gentle. The best of them understood that human beings are not tidy creatures and kept a drawer full of mercy. The worst brandished rules like cudgels and scowled at weddings as if joy were a heresy. Most were in between, which is to say human and worried about roof leaks like everyone else. Markets and feast days, fairs and saints' vigils, these were the social calendars upon which hearts scribbled appointments. On feast days, candles gilded plain faces, ale smoothed shyness, songs rose that everyone knew. Touch was regulated, but a dance could bend a rule with grace. Hands brushed on purpose, by accident. Eyes met between verses. A ribbon appeared on a sleeve where none had been that morning. You didn't need a troubadour to tell you something had begun. The mill was a notorious accomplice. Grain required waiting. Waiting required talking. Wheels turned flour. Dust floated, and in the pale cloud people met one another's patience. Mills also gathered rumor, like lint, so two people could leave with more than flour news had adhered to their clothes. Wells did similar work. Water enjoys company. Couples met there under the pretense that buckets are heavy, which they are. Add to these the church porch where everyone stood before and after Mass. Their proposals could be born without anyone admitting they were present at the birth. A young man might test the distance between good day and good future. A young woman might see whether this one made jokes at other people's expense. The heart keeps a fine ledger of kindnesses. And yes, there was cruelty. Marriages arranged across unwillingness. Young people yoked to older strangers because fields demanded it. A girl with a lively laugh who learned to silence it. A boy good at songs given to a wife who scorned them. The world was not a romance, and no amount of candlelight can make some rooms warm. But memory is a selective archivist. It also kept the sweetness. The child who learned to walk between two hands. The cow that calved in a blizzard and survived because two people worked together by lantern until their fingers burned the small joke at day's end that made a tired meal taste dear. Rules about blood and bands mind the doors, but within the house, two people built a country. Perhaps the clearest way to understand medieval dating is to admit the word doesn't fit and then listen anyway. There were approaches, negotiations, trial periods, disguised as helpfulness, refusals couched as modesty, and arrangements shaped by so many external forces that free will sometimes felt like a feather on a scale of iron. Yet a feather can tip a scale if the moment is right. In quiet corners, people found agency: a girl who drew out a betrothal long enough for another suit to arrive, a boy who saved enough coin and favor to present himself as safe if not prosperous, an aunt who whispered to a priest that a band should take a fourth Sunday just to be sure, buying time for what needed time. Even the legal phrase mutual consent smuggled a rebellion into the law. It insisted that two voices must speak. As for desire, it learned to wear disguises. It pretended to be politeness, then kindness, then habit, until one winter night a hand found another under the table at last and stayed there. And what of beauty? The medieval world praised it in poems and distrusted it in practice. A handsome face was a dangerous kind of property, impossible to fence and likely to wander. Villages valued sturdiness, gait, teeth. The church valued modesty on others and carved it into sermons that clanged like cookware. Still, beauty did its old sorcery beneath the rules, as it always does, and got blamed for the consequences, as it always has. The paradox of the age is this: the more the world tried to make marriage a machine for producing grain, heirs, and order, the more love acted like water, finding cracks, seeping under doors, pooling in unlikely places, softening what seemed hard. That softness is the miracle this chapter wants you to notice. Love didn't overthrow the system. It didn't need to. It learned the schedule of the bells, then arrived late with flowers anyway. Which brings us to a small truth worth taking to bed. People change each other. A practical match sometimes turned affectionate. because daily work is intimate and intimacy given time, and an absence of cruelty grows toward gentleness. A mercenary match sometimes warmed because a shared joke is a gateway drug, and arranged or not marriages produced stories, and stories produced the patience to make tomorrow's bread. If you find yourself judging them, imagine the pressures off stage, the harvest that failed, the taxes that didn't, the plague that had recently taught everyone how quickly a chair could be empty. In that light, choosing someone who could be trusted with the lamp at midnight feels less like cynicism and more like wisdom. So no, there was no dating in the modern sense, no theater tickets, no private tables, no starlit walks without an ant materializing from behind a shrub. What there was, negotiations wrapped in neighborliness, rituals wrapped in prayer, longing wrapped in metaphor, and the stubborn human preference for company over solitude when the wind turned mean. You might still call it romance, only dressed in wool and mud. Keep that image as we move forward, the ledger and the lamp. The ledger keeps the household alive. The lamp makes the household worth keeping. Between them, medieval love learned to breathe. And if sometimes it wheezed well, so do we. Now let the bell fade into the distance. Ahead lie the muddy lanes where peasant hearts barter for winter, the high halls where silk sleeves hide size the letters that travel by candle and rumor. But first take one more deep breath. We're not in a hurry. History isn't either. Peasant courtship. Love in the mud. At sunrise, the village wakes the way a hearth wakes slowly by degrees. Chickens argue with the light smoke climbs out of low thatch, and boots find their way into yesterday's ruts. If you are looking for medieval dating, you won't find it here. You will find chores. And inside those chores, quietly as steam rising from pottage, you will find courtship. Love among peasants doesn't begin with candlelit promises. It begins with a bucket, a hoe, a sheep that refuses to be reasonable, and two people who discover one mild morning that they work well side by side. The first rule of peasant romance is that attraction notices competence before it notices cheekbones. Hands that can lift, mend, knead, glean, shear, thatch without falling, these are as persuasive as poetry. A steady gait means fewer broken eggs. A good singing voice means harvest goes more pleasantly. A decent set of teeth is a luxury item and should be treasured accordingly. It's not that beauty doesn't matter. It's that winter has opinions. If you can split kindling true and stir porridge without letting it scorch, you already speak the dialect of desire. The village is a map of possible meetings. The well is a marketplace for glances. The mill is a waiting room for conversation. At the communal bakehouse, you can offer to carry someone's loaf boards and learn a great deal about their patience while the oven cools to perfection. The church porch before and after Mass is both the town square and the comment section. You will be seen there, and being seen is part of being known. The common fields and meadows host the great seasonal theater. In haymaking time, whole households spread and turn swathes under a June sun that forgives almost anything. If you want an excuse to talk, carry a rake. If you want an excuse to listen, carry two. Peasant gifts are practical, modest, and occasionally endearing beyond all reason. A carved spoon means I was thinking of you by firelight. A bundle of kindling by a door says I noticed last night's cold. Eggs, when hens are stingy, rank as love letters you can eat. A ribbon woven at the edge of a long winter evening, narrow, neat, the color of berries you won't see again until summer can travel from girl to boy, boy to girl, hand to pocket, sleeve to sleeve without anyone admitting it is a promise. You can tell a great deal about a person by how they receive a turnip presented sincerely. Parents are not villains in this story. They are weather. They track clouds. You cannot. They know which families pay debts, which roofs leak, which tempers bite after ale. A mother will watch the way a prospective son-in-law handles a lame lamb and learn everything she needs to know about his patience. A father will notice whether a girl keeps her broom by the door bristles up or bristles down and file the information under habits. Their interference is maddening, but their logic is ancient. A household is two sets of habits attempting to coexist without burning the stew. Economics stands at every threshold, though it tries not to be rude about it. Marriage means founding a new hearth or joining an existing one, and that requires resources, tools, linen, a mattress stuffed with something better than regret. Many young people spend years in service hired to other households, earning small wages and instruction. These years are a kind of slow apprenticeship and living get-up when told, do what's needful, save coin, carefully acquire the habits that will make a future spouse nod approvingly. A servant who returns home with a decent cloak, a respectable chest, and no scandal attached has already written the first paragraph of their marriage proposal without opening their mouth. The manorial world adds its own bureaucratic poetry. In some places, a man who marries a daughter from outside the manor owes a fine to his lord because her labor, like hay, is local produce and should not be exported without paperwork. It is called merchet, and it is unromantic in exactly the way most paperwork is unromantic. Still, couples navigate it the way they navigate muddy lanes with boots, laughter, and occasional muttering. The reeve who knows everyone's business by divine right of being nosy for a living will ensure the dues are paid and the gossip duly circulated. And what of chaperonage among peasants' privacy is an expensive luxury in one-room houses, so most interactions are public by default. You talk while carrying, while weeding, while shelling beans in the yard as neighbors do the same. A sister hovers, a cousin happens to be there, a child is sent along just in case the geese are feisty. The village doesn't forbid conversation. It supervises it by existing. The safest words are said where everyone can pretend not to hear. Peasant humor is a courtship strategy. You can't offer a sonnet, but you can offer a remark about old Thomas falling in the mill pond again that makes someone laugh so hard they drop a bundle of flax. Wit is useful, the world is heavy, and anyone who can make it lighter earns consideration. But cruelty is noticed and remembered. A joke that punches down will return to you like a stray dog, tooth-marked and unwilling to leave. Feast days are festivals of sanctioned looseness. On May Day, the village plays at being wild within boundaries, and boundaries are the important part. There is dancing on the green. There are wreaths and ribbons, and the boldness that comes with borrowed garlands. A hand rests 2 heartbeats too long on a forearm, and nobody pretends not to notice. They simply pretend not to mind. At harvest suppers, when the last sheaf is stood and the last jug is tilted, songs pull people close without permission slips. You will see pairings form like weather fronts. You will see them disperse by Martinmas. The church, for its part, frowns at exuberance, and then, if the curate is wise, lets the village be a village so long as banns are called and promises kept. Penance exists for those who step outside the marked path, but it is usually measured in prayers and public apologies rather than thunderbolts. The real threat is not punishment from above, but disgrace among neighbors. A woman accused lightly, and often of lightness, will find doors closing against her. A man known for breaking words will find that a reputation runs faster than he does. Bundles of detail matter here, because love among peasants accumulates in bundles. When the cow calves badly, and he shows up unasked with a rope and a calm voice, he writes himself into your ledger under reliable. When her little brother runs a fever and she sits up holding him while the mother dozes, she writes herself into your heart under steadfast. These are not grand gestures. They are daily labor. If the Middle Ages made marriage into an engine, peasant affection is the oil unseen, indispensable, only noticed when missing. There is also the art of refusing gracefully. The village is small. You must live among your almosts. A girl can avoid a suitor by always being busy in the opposite direction. A boy can invest himself conspicuously in mending a cart whenever a certain laughter approaches. Mothers absorb messages. Fathers deliver them in roundabout ways. Sometimes a flat no is necessary, and then one hopes for the kind of dignity that leaves both parties able to share a lane to church without needing separate seasons. Not every love comes to the altar. A few go the way of songs, bright brief told afterward with rueful smiles. Service pulls one away to another parish. A bad harvest rearranges everyone's math. A brother dies and a daughter must stay to keep a parent fed. Sorrow in peasant life is rarely operatic. It is logistical, but that doesn't make it smaller. The woman who keeps her ribbon in a chest for 20 years doesn't imagine herself a heroine. She imagines finishing the day's work and opening the chest, sometimes in a quiet hour, because it holds a part of a life that might have been. When a match does move forward, it moves with deliberate steps. There's talk between households, a testing of temper and terms. Dowry might be a cow and linens. Contribution on the groom's side might be a tool chest seat, a promise regarding a share of a field. Witnesses are drafted not for romance, but for memory. You want 3 people who can say later what was said now. The bands then ring through 3 Sundays. In those weeks, time has a peculiar taste, half anticipation, half dread, that a forgotten promise might emerge from a hedge like a pheasant. If all goes smoothly, the vows themselves may be simple, the feast modest, the ale slightly too warm and entirely satisfactory. Wedding days are work days with garnish. Everything that can be done in advance will be done, and everything else will be improvised. A pig is roasted bread, blessed a garland hung abed, such as it is made ready. There may be teasing on the processional. If the teasing bites, an ant will annihilate the offender with a glance. Gifts pile without grandeur, a kettle, a stool, a knife whose edge promises to be loyal. The dance afterward is where the village tests its future, who laughs together, who disappears kindly to see that a grandmother gets home before the dew. The first months of marriage among peasants are less a honeymoon and more a tutorial. Where does the sweepings pile go? How does he feel about the proper angle of kindling? Does she salt the pottage too boldly? Each discovery is an adjustment, a treaty. Money is counted, but so is time. If he lingers in the yard to repair a neighbor's wheel, what does that say about his heart? If she welcomes a stray cat to the hearth despite the extra mouth, what does that say about hers? The language of love here is composed of practical verbs. We should speak too of tenderness because it hides so neatly inside hard days that it can be missed. A hand on a shoulder at the end of a long sewing. A murmured joke shared at someone else's boasting. Quiet singing to a fussy child while a pot hums and the world outside pretends to be eternal. These are the very small rooms where peasant love lives and grows. From the road you see only smoke and hear only geese. From the inside you see 2 people learning not to waste each other's strength. And if we must add the pinch of humor that preserves truth, yes, there are clumsy moments. A boy tries to look capable and spends 10 minutes wrestling with a gate that opens inward. A girl tries to seem indifferent and forgets she is wearing his ribbon. He boasts about his thatching, and then storms come to audit. She praises his singing, and then discovers he knows exactly 1 verse to every song. The village which loves a tale will keep these moments in circulation at a gentle simmer for years. Laughter can be unkind. It can also be a communal way of saying, We were there when you were young. There are cautions. Drink can ruin a courtship, and so can pride. A man who cannot say I was wrong to a hen will not say it to a wife. People notice. A woman who despises other women will find herself despised in turn. People notice that too. The small stage of the village magnifies virtues and vices equally. The nearest thing to advice, should any medieval peasant be in the mood to accept advice, would be this: be the kind of person others trust, with sharp tools and small children. Everything else follows. If this all sounds unromantic, close your eyes and listen again. Hear the rhythm of two sets of boots matching each other's pace down a lane. Hear the knock at dusk that says, I have brought you a wedge of cheese because today was hard. Hear the scrape of a stool pushed back so one can rise to stir while the other stays seated for the first time all day. Romance here is a series of ordinary mercies performed faithfully until they become extraordinary. And yes, there were moments almost grand. A girl running across a yard in summer rain laughing because she forgot to bring in the washing and now everything smells like sky. A boy standing absolutely still holding a lantern while a calf is born. The midwife shouting and everyone's hands working at once, and in the bright ring of light he looks up and meets her eyes, and they both know something that cannot be said because the calf is breathing and that is enough for now. If you can't call that romantic, you may be allergic to reality. Eventually, years pass, and the couple who once traded eggs and glances become the couple others come to for advice. They will shrug because advice is for people with time, but they will say, small, true things, keep a spare bucket, don't borrow trouble, forgive quickly in summer and slowly in winter. Everyone is tired by Michaelmas. The best story about your marriage is the one no one else needs to hear. Love in this world is a craft, not a miracle. It has miracles inside it, like raisins in bread, but the bread is flour, salt, water, heat, and hands. That is peasant courtship, a choreography of tasks that lets two people prove themselves useful and kind in the same direction. No lute required, though. A song helps. No balcony, though. A low fence can be scaled if one truly insists. The mud is part of the beauty. It means the land is fertile. And so if you are lucky, is the heart you are offering. If the village laughs at you, let it. Villages laugh at everything. Work well. Share warmth. Keep faith. Romance will find you doing both and decide to stay for supper. The rules of noble romance. If peasant love was shaped by weather and work, noble love was sculpted from parchment and politics. It wore velvet instead of wool, but the heart underneath still beat with the same stubborn rhythm. The difference was that every sigh, every vow, every flutter of feeling had to pass through an obstacle course built from heraldry alliances and a church with opinions about everything, including how long a kiss could last before it endangered a soul. To be born noble was to enter life as someone's strategic asset. From the moment a child cried in a tower nursery, the sound echoed through the family's accounting books. A boy might inherit land. A girl might acquire it through marriage. Either way, both existed partly as future contracts. Love, when it appeared, was a mischief maker, an uninvited minstrel at the banquet. No parent wanted to feed that minstrel, yet somehow it always found a way to sing. Most noble children were betrothed before they learned to read, sometimes before they learned to walk. A parchment sealed in wax could bind two families together for decades before the couple themselves could form an opinion about it. Marriage for love was a phrase that could make entire councils laugh so hard they spilled their wine. A proper marriage had purposes unite lands, end feuds, strengthen claims, settle debts. Romantic affection was not required, though it could develop later, like mold on cheese, accidental, unpredictable, and sometimes surprisingly pleasant. Picture a castle hall banners, hanging candles, trembling, a marriage contract unrolled like a battlefield map. Two fathers discuss acreage rents and whose cousin offended whose bishop. A scribe scratches notes in Latin. A priest blesses. A mother smiles as though she has swallowed a pearl whole. Somewhere nearby, the future bride practices the art of graceful silence, and the groom adjusts his sleeves, wondering whether she is tall or short, kind or unkind, alive or merely described as such. The match is agreed upon. The document folded. Witnesses sign. Later, minstrels will sing of destiny, but destiny is written by clerks with good handwriting. The noble wedding itself is both splendid and slightly terrifying. The church provides grandeur bells, choirs, candles. The family provides money. The bride and groom provide composure. They may meet for the first time at the altar, a fact that never ceases to astonish modern romantics. There is nothing quite like saying I do to a stranger while half your extended relatives glare at you with the tense joy of gamblers watching dice roll. And yet, despite the formality, there is tenderness hidden in corners. A nervous glance exchanged while the Latin drifts overhead. A whispered joke between two people who realize that for better or worse, they're in this spectacle together. Marriage, even an arranged one, had a way of revealing shared humanity under the armor of protocol. Survival of the heart, like survival of estates, required cooperation. Once married, the noble couple entered a life that resembled polite warfare. A lady managed the household servants, accounts, tapestries, the small army of people responsible for ensuring the castle didn't collapse under its own etiquette. A lord managed the lands, disputes, hunting rights, the occasional rebellion. They might spend months apart, he at war, she at court, or in confinement with pregnancies that too often ended in churchyards. Letters bridged the distance, formal, cautious-edged with longing, but rarely saying so directly. They were written like chess games, each phrase a move that balanced affection against decorum. In this world, love was often imported from literature. Noble society fed itself on romances, the stories of Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, all those doomed lovers who made bad decisions look heroic. The irony, of course, was that these tales were usually performed at banquets by minstrels hired by the very class whose marriages were most allergic to passion. People cheered tragic devotion while negotiating the next dowry. If hypocrisy were a commodity, the nobility could have paid all its debts with it. Courtship, when it did exist among nobles, required choreography. A glance across the great hall could mean 10 different things depending on timing, audience, and whether your cousin was feuding with her cousin. Conversation unfolded like embroidery, delicate, detailed, and designed to avoid directness. Compliments traveled in metaphors, your eyes like morning dew, your virtue like a fortress, and were then analyzed by ladies-in-waiting for weeks to determine whether they implied true interest or simply practiced politeness. Etiquette manuals existed written by men who clearly never had to flirt in real life. They advised restraint, modest gestures, and a general demeanor of holiness slightly tarnished by charm. A noble woman who laughed too loudly was reckless. One who never laughed was rumored to be plotting something. A man who praised a lady's beauty too boldly risked being called a libertine. One who ignored her entirely risked being called a fool. The middle ground, gentle admiration seasoned with plausible deniability, was the safest terrain. In this rarefied air, emotion became theater. Grand gestures replaced genuine intimacy. A knight might wear a lady's colors into battle not because he expected reward, but because it gave his wounds poetic value. A lady might favor a knight not because she liked him, but because his victories polished her reputation like sunlight on silver. Love was not so much forbidden as domesticated, kept on a leash, groomed for display, and released only in poems. Yet underneath the performance, hearts occasionally rebelled. History and rumor both record noble couples who fell in real love after marriage or despite it. Sometimes they began as wary business partners and grew into companions who shared jokes about their pompous relatives. Sometimes they suffered together illness, loss, exile, and discovered that suffering is the most efficient matchmaker of all. There are letters from the 15th century where a husband addresses his wife not as my lady but as my friend. They read like quiet miracles. Still, for every miracle there were a dozen tragedies. Love affairs across class or creed could end in disgrace, imprisonment, or worse. The church tolerated discreet affection within bounds, but drew bright lines around adultery and noble gossip, enforced those lines more cruelly than any priest. A lady caught in scandal might be sent to a convent for reflection, which was less a spiritual retreat and more an indefinite sentence of embroidery and regret. A man exposed in infidelity risked public penance fines or a dagger from an aggrieved husband. The safest love story was always the one that stayed mostly imaginary. Inheritance laws added another layer of romance-killing complexity. A noble family's land had to pass to legitimate heirs. Emphasis on legitimate. Love that produced children outside marriage endangered fortunes. That was why virginity before the wedding was not just a moral concern, but a financial one. It kept the bloodline's accounting tidy. A daughter's body was effectively a trust fund managed by everyone except herself. The church preached chastity. Fathers audited it. Education played its part in how love was expressed. Noble boys learned Latin heraldry and how to manage estates. Noble girls learned French music and how to pretend that embroidery was interesting. When they met, conversation was shaped by these lessons. A compliment could be wrapped in a reference to Virgil. A refusal could arrive disguised as a theological question. Love required an intellect agile enough to dance within the narrow ballroom of acceptability. And then there were tournaments, the medieval equivalent of dating shows broadcast in full armor. A knight declared devotion to a lady, fought under her token, and occasionally won. Everyone knew the system. It was half ritual, half flirtation, and entirely public. The lady smiled, distributed ribbons, and maintained an expression suggesting both gratitude and indifference. If the knight survived, he might receive a glove or a nod. If he died, he received immortality in song and an eye roll from practical women who knew that good farmhands were scarcer than poets. The castle household itself functioned like a rumor engine. Pages, squires, ladies-in-waiting all carried whispers between chambers faster than any messenger. If a young lord lingered too long near a particular window, the servants would notice. If a lady requested her harp be moved closer to a certain corridor, someone would interpret that as strategy. Privacy was a luxury rarer than gold leaf. For this reason, love often had to disguise itself as piety. Lovers met in chapels, exchanged prayers as if they were vows, and discovered that kneeling side by side could be surprisingly intimate. Nothing hides better than sincerity. Not all noble relationships were grim transactions. Some families, perhaps worn down by centuries of negotiating alliances, decided that peace in the household was worth more than another 10 acres. These were the quiet revolutionaries, the parents who allowed their children to marry people they actually liked. Chroniclers rarely mention them because happiness is poor entertainment, but letters, wills, and the survival of jokes in family archives hint at their existence. When genuine affection blossomed, it often expressed itself through patronage. A loving husband might commission a chapel window depicting his wife's favorite saint. A loving wife might fund a book of hours illuminated with her husband's crest, entwined with vines. Affection became art-visible proof that devotion could be both moral and decorative. Even cynics admired the craftsmanship. But what about those who never found affection at all? Many noble marriages remained courteous but cold, a lifetime of parallel lives under one roof. The husband hunted, the wife managed. They met at dinner like colleagues forced to share a cubicle the size of a kingdom. Politeness covered emptiness, like fine dust over stone. Some endured it quietly. Others sought consolation elsewhere. Religion, poetry, occasionally, an enthusiastic falcon. One chronicler noted a lord who loved his hawk more than his wife. The margin comment in that manuscript reads, simply, understandable. For noble women, the risks were sharper. Their choices were narrow, their conduct scrutinized. Yet they found ways to carve small freedoms. A lady could manage estates while her husband campaigned. She could arrange her children's futures with more subtlety than her own had been arranged. Letters show them running manors, negotiating rents, and occasionally firing priests who irritated them. Power even borrowed could teach a woman to see herself differently. Sometimes, love began in that recognition, a husband realizing his wife was not a decorative saint but a partner who could outthink him. Sometimes love ended there when he realized the same thing and disliked it. It is tempting to judge this world harshly, to declare its marriages, prisons, and its romances hypocrisies. But perhaps the more charitable view is that nobles trapped in their gilded duties simply invented new ways to express what everyone else expressed by instinct. They turned emotion into art desire, into ritual loyalty, into lineage, and occasionally, against the odds, two people found the person beneath the title. History remembers their castles. We can remember their glances. By the end of the Middle Ages, the idea of love itself had begun to shift. Troubadours and poets had sown the seeds of a new thought that affection might ennoble as surely as bloodline. The Church grudgingly absorbed some of this sentiment, preaching that mutual love strengthened marriage rather than endangered it. It was progress measured in size, not revolutions, but size add up. So when you imagine a noble wedding, think less of crowns and more of calculus. Two families balancing ambition, two individuals trying to locate humanity amid ceremony. Somewhere in the corner, a bard strums a lute, singing about love, as if it ruled the world. Everyone knows better, but no one tells him to stop. Because for all their power, the nobles still like to believe that one day maybe someone might sing about them and mean it. Courtly love, the art of longing. If noble marriage was an alliance written in ink, courtly love was the margin doodle vines, hearts, and a small knight climbing a ladder no one asked him to climb. It was the medieval world's most organized, crushed, civilized yearning with excellent manners practiced in chambers perfumed with rosemary and philosophy. The premise was simple and impossible. Adore a lady who is not yours. Prove your worth by suffering beautifully, and do absolutely nothing that would satisfy you or alarm her husband. The fashion took shape in the 12th century along the warm lyrical strip of Europe we call Occitania, where troubadours invented songs with as many rules as a monastery and as much longing as a drought. They called it finamore refined, love, filtered, clarified, poured into a crystal glass and sipped slowly while someone played the vielle. The lady was the domna placed on a height, moral and architectural. The poet often hid her name behind a coded nickname, the Sinhal, so that everyone at court could pretend not to guess correctly. The music was tender, the metaphors careful, the yearning punctual. In theory, this love improved you. Desire became a school. The syllabus listed humility, generosity, courtesy, and secrecy. You learned to hold your tongue steady. Your gaze, moderate your boasts, give alms, keep confidences, rinse and repeat until your pride softened into something almost thoughtful. If ordinary infatuation makes people ridiculous, courtly love tried to make them bearable. Suffer, it said, but write neatly about it. The more inconvenient the love, the more it promised to polish the soul as if the heart were brass and despair a fine sand. Our best-known manual on the subject is a 12th century treatise, often attributed to Andreas Capellanus, who approached love the way a clerk approaches a ledger. He listed rules, categorized symptoms, offered cases from imaginary tribunals. Avarice, he warned, is the enemy of love, which is true whether you wear silk or homespun. He also suggested cheerfully disastrously that real love rarely thrives inside marriage, a line that surely helped sales at the time and ruined dinners afterward. Whether Andreas was sincere, satirical, or merely ambitious remains a debate. The important point is that people copied his book, quoted it, and behaved as though love were both a fever and a code. Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie of Champagne hover like patron saints over this world, not because they invented love, but because their courts hosted its theater. Poets tuned their strings under their windows. Storytellers tested new plots in their halls. Later writers would talk about courts of love, where high-born ladies judged romantic disputes. Did he adore enough? Did she reward too easily? Historians grumble that these were more salon than courtroom, more witty conversation than verdict. Still, the image lingered women for once presiding over the rules of a game, men usually wrote. Whether or not official verdicts were ever handed down, unofficial ones certainly were, and reputations rose or fell accordingly. The choreography looked like this. A knight chose a lady above his reach, married higher ranked or simply too luminous for the practical world. He pledged service, not ownership, not even expectation, merely the intention to become better in her light. He wore her colors blue ribbon at the sleeve, a favor tucked near the heart into tournaments where everything was both deadly and decorative. He wrote lyrics that praised her eyes, which resembled natural phenomena, that had the good sense to be distant stars' dawn, the occasional morally uplifting brook. He promised obedience within bounds and silence beyond them. And he waited. She, for her part, had the difficult role accept devotion without inviting disaster, encourage virtue without encouraging scandal, remain admired, not besieged. A glance could be a benediction, a token, an absolution, a word carefully chosen, carefully placed, a winter's worth of courage. If she was clever, and she usually had to be, she could direct this eager, armored comet toward noble tasks. Defend the weak curb, your tongue pay, your debts, go pray until the urge to compose bad poetry fades. In this theater, the lady was stage star and sometimes director. The plot succeeded when nothing happened. Around them, literature bloomed. Tristan and Isolde brewed long sorrow. Lancelot and Guinevere perfected the art of noble catastrophe. The Rondella Rose spun an allegorical garden where desire chased itself in loops of dream logic. Even when these stories ended badly, and they often did, they fed the conviction that ardor was a virtue provided it tasted of restraint. The best love, the poets insisted, was the kind that could be told to a confessor without having to switch languages halfway through. The paradox is the point. Courtly love celebrated adultery in everything but deed and then demanded you stop precisely where life becomes interesting. It made emotional fidelity to someone else part of the moral education of a person already married or destined to be. That moral haze gave the fashion both its glamour and its absurdity. It was a safety valve, say some scholars, bleeding off passion from marriages built for politics. It was a social polish, say others, teaching powerful people to handle power without trampling hearts. It was also, frankly, entertainment eloquent people showing off in a world hungry for eloquence. Tournaments turned this inward drama outward. Imagine a field edged with pavilions stitched like candy trumpets, pennants shining horses, and then always the rational fear of death. Knights tilted, broke lances tumbled, rose bowed. The lady's favor glove sleeve, the thin mercy of a ribbon, fluttered like a private flag above public risk. If he won, he rode beneath her window as if the moon were watching. If he lost, he pretended to have intended a moral lesson. Either way, songs were written. A skeptical aunt might observe over embroidery that blacksmiths should receive equal adoration. The poets did not take the hint. Language itself developed calluses and grace to carry all this feeling. In Occitan songs, you'll find joy, joy as discipline, a joy sharpened by absence. You'll find the beloved coded under a false name because truth travels faster than even the fastest page. You'll find arguments in verse between poets' tensos, where love becomes a debate conducted with courteous knives. In French, romance's desire walks fully armed through allegory. Reason lectures, beauty beckons jealousy, locks doors, hope forges keys. If this sounds exhausting, remember that exhaustion is soothing when sung slowly by a warm voice in a candlelit room. The church watched with an expression perfected over centuries, concern trimmed with curiosity. On the one hand, talk of extramarital devotion smelled of sin. On the other, the emphasis on self-restraint made bishops hum contentedly. Preachers warned that romantic songs softened spines. Confessors heard behind the sighs, lives trying to be decent in complicated rooms. The best pastors did what they often do, redirected energy toward charity and reminded the lovelorn that prayer was a form of attention that never embarrassed anyone. Was there consummation? Sometimes, of course. People are people, and poetry does not make doors any heavier. But the code praised the edge more than the plunge. The perfect knight loved so purely that his longing improved harvests by example alone. The perfect lady remained so worthy that granting even a smile could have toppled governments. These ideals were unattainable by design. That was their function, to set a horizon against which ordinary attempts at gentleness could be measured and on good days improved. For women, the code cut both ways. It crowned them moral arbiters and reduced them to metaphors. It gave them leverage and stole their agency. A lady accustomed to being traded like a map suddenly held a kind of court in which a man's virtue rose or fell by her word. Yet if she misstepped, the same poets who praised her could punish her with jokes that spread faster than ink dries. She was inspiration, custodian, and scapegoat in one miraculous body. Some navigated this with sly brilliance, setting tasks. Instead of temptations requiring charity instead of sonnets. Others were overwhelmed by admirations that glowed too hot for safety. Courtly love did its strangest work, not in beds but in tempers. It taught people not to sneer at tenderness, to admire self-control, to speak carefully in a world where carelessness had cavalry. Courtesy, that slippery jewel of a word, owes some of its shine to these performances. The sense that power should bow, that desire should ask permission, that praise is not a tax you levy but a gift you craft. The fashion's civilized edges it could not remove. Call it polishing a lance, still a weapon, but less likely to split a friend. And what of the many who had no time for this art? The steward chasing accounts, the nurse with a fussy child, the kitchen master rescuing a sauce. They became the audience, and sometimes the critics. A kitchen can hear everything, and no one tells a more accurate story than a person whose hands smell of rosemary and ash. The servants saw who truly risked something, who merely posed, which tokens were returned, folded, which were kept hidden in a sleeve long enough to be meaningful. Courtly love might speak in high rooms, but it had witnesses downstairs. Eventually, fashion shift. By the later Middle Ages, the code frayed. War grew uglier, piety stranger, money louder. The printing press arrived like a new kind of minstrel, faster, tireless, indifferent to blushes. Yet the idea that longing can refine us did not vanish. It dipped beneath theology and re-emerged in manners. It slipped past politics and flowered in novels. The strange promise survived. Wanting something you cannot have might still teach you how to be good for the things you do. If you want an emblem for courtly love, don't choose a heart, choose a ladder. The knight climbs service restraint, courage, silence, never expecting to reach the window, aware that the climbing itself is the lesson. Or choose a candle, small flame, disciplined, light enough to read by, not enough to burn the house. Or if you prefer honesty, choose a sigh well-timed in a crowded hall, a quiet signal that meaning can live safely inside decorum if nurtured by patience. From a modern seat, it's easy to smile at all this grown people turning crushes into catechisms. But imagine the relief, too, of being told that feeling much does not require doing much, that your restless heart can be taught to become a gentle instrument, that love might be measured not by conquest, but by control. In a world violent in 100 respectable ways, restraint could feel like rebellion. So the next time you hear a song about impossible love, hear also the clink of goblets, the creak of leather, the scratch of a goose quill spelling out a name no one must read aloud. Somewhere, a lady lifts her eyes from a book of hours. Somewhere, a young man lowers his, chastened and grateful. Between them stands a code, half beautiful, half absurd, fully human, and in that narrow, courteous space, the Middle Ages discovered a tenderness that could survive witnesses. Tokens, gifts, and secret letters. Before there were private rooms, there were private objects. In a world where walls listened and windows gossiped, love learned to speak through things: a ribbon, a spoon, a glove, a line of ink folded under wax. Tokens were the grammar of feeling, small nouns that carried verbs too dangerous to say aloud. You could refuse a sentence. It is harder to refuse a gift placed gently in your palm with the world pretending not to look. Among peasants, tokens were practical first and poetic by accident. A carved wooden spoon meant more than dinner. It meant hours stolen from sleep, knife strokes, measured in thought, the bowl smooth with someone's patience. A bundle of kindling left by your door after a storm said, "I noticed you were cold." An egg offered in a lean month said, "I would shorten my portion for you." A strip of ribbon woven from leftover threads, berry red, sky blue, could be braided into hair or tied to a wrist. A promise modest enough that even a sharp-eyed aunt might let it pass. Bone or horn knives polished by use traveled between hands. A small whetstone exchanged at the well was half joke, half oath. "I will keep what you give me sharp." Peasant love wrapped meaning in usefulness, because usefulness kept families alive. A distaff smoothed and carved with a sprig of rosemary implied remembrance as surely as any poem. A small broom bristles bound tighter than necessary implied care for futures not yet swept. When words were costly, repairs were romantic. "I fixed the hinge," a boy might say, and the sentence carried as much heat as "I adore you" in a better funded language. Even food learned symbolism. A wedge of fresh cheese traded when cows were newly calved tasted of hope more than milk. A heel of good bread laid aside through the day and offered at dusk meant you were on my mind at noon. Nobles played the same game on a richer board. Gloves were messages in leather, delicate kid for tenderness, heavier gauntlets for spectacle. A lady might drop a glove by accident where the right eyes could retrieve it. A knight might wear that captured hand at his sleeve as if it guided his arm. Sleeves themselves became vocabulary. To detach your sleeve and gift, it was to license admiration. To wear someone's colors braided through a cuff was to fly a small, portable banner of loyal attention. Girdles, pins, and brooches spoke in gemstones and craft. Jet whispered mourning and gravity. Pearls murmured purity. Amber warmed with the heat of a palm, and was therefore thought a little dangerous. Rings condensed entire sentences into circles. In the late Middle Ages, posy rings carried mottos in cramped secret letters, French or Latin tucked, where only skin could read de cœur entier, with whole heart souvenez de moi, remember me, or the cheerful, reckless amor vincit omnia. To give a ring was not always to promise. Marriage lawyers would have liked that clarity, but it was to admit seriousness. The church frowned at ambiguity and then pragmatically kept excellent records of it. In quarrels, tokens became witnesses. He gave me, this could mean the difference between tears and a fine. Piety provided excellent camouflage. A paternoster, what we'd call a rosary, could be counted by day for prayer and counted by night for longing. Beads of coral, bone, or glass slid silently, while a mind replayed a glance. If anyone asked, you were thinking of saints. Books of hours, personal prayer books with painted pictures small enough to hide inside a breath-collected pressed flowers and scraps of ribbon like a second secret liturgy. A lover might tuck a sliver of parchment in the gutter of a page beside the Annunciation, trusting that the reader would take Gabriel's courage as precedent. Girdle books fastened by long tabs to a belt swung against the hip with every step. One could hide a picture there, nothing explicit, merely a sprig of rosemary painted with too much care to be merely botanical. Flowers and herbs furnished a village's emoji keyboard. Rosemary remembered. Violets promised modesty. Rue regretted. Hawthorn warned. Meadowsweet lightened grief. Daisies, marguerites. Let a girl named Marjorie declare herself without spelling lessons. Not all meanings were stable. No medieval council standardized the lexicon, but the gist traveled with seasons. A posy pinned where it could be seen said as much as a paragraph, and because flowers wilted, they argued for speed answer today before the message turns brown. Letters were the most daring tokens, portable hearts wrapped in paper. Literacy lurked unevenly across the map of Christendom, but where it lived, it bred ingenuity. A peasant girl might ask the parish clerk to write for her, and the clerk would pretend not to know that the recipient would ask him to read it aloud 2 days later. A noblewoman might write in her own hand, neat, persuasive, full of trained curves, and seal with green wax if the message were hopeful, black if it carried grief, red if it needed haste. Wax was the door. The signet ring was the key. To break a seal meant to step into someone else's house. A servant who delivered a letter unopened wore invisible honor. A servant who piqued gambled with livelihood and soul. The prose of medieval letters was more polite than modern messages because the world around them was not. To my entirely beloved began notes between people who had barely spoken, not because they were insincere, but because custom knew how fragile beginnings can be. You thanked God for the health of the recipient, even if he had a cough. You begged news by the next trustworthy hand. You slipped news about grain prices between metaphors about stars and saints, so the letter could be defended as practical if discovered. In courtly settings, a senhal, a code name, kept the lady unnamed while ensuring everyone interested recognized her at once. In villages, a heart was disguised under market talk. Please tell your mother I found the good onions a line might read, and everyone understood onions were not the point. How did you send a letter on foot if near? By horse if wealthy, by pilgrimage if cautious. A cousin bound for a shrine could carry more than prayers. A peddler might tuck a folded square among needles and lace. A monk might slip one beneath a binding strap with an expression of absolute innocence perfected through practice. Time stretched. Responses took days or never. Patience learned to sit with hope and not be rude. If modern lovers suffer from too much instant clarity, medieval ones suffered from its absence, and from that absence made a virtue, faith. Encryption existed, though it preferred to call itself cleverness. Lovers wrote acrostics, first letters of lines spelling names. They sprinkled capital letters with intention. They quoted psalms whose numbers added up to dates. Latin served as a curtain if family intruded. Dialect served if priests did. The only widely used cipher was, frankly, terrible handwriting. Many secrets were protected not by code, but by courtesy. The understanding that some envelopes should not be unsealed, and some silences should not be questioned too aggressively, if you wanted your own discretion respected on a future market. Day. Go-betweens carried reputation like jugs of milk spilled proof if you respected them, sour if you didn't. Older women with common sense and uncommon hearing made the best intermediaries. They knew which door to knock, which phrase would calm a frightened girl. I will stand in the porch while you speak. Which man would mistake kindness for invitation and therefore needed stiffening with a proverb. A chaplain with a gentle face might ferry a scrap of parchment tucked inside a homily. A steward might make room for a parcel of ribbon and a crate of pepper. Every castle had at least one person who could be trusted with almost anything because they had already seen worse. Every village had at least one who could not be trusted with a thimble because the thimble would be a ballad by sundown. Tokens had rules, some written, most felt. Too costly a gift to too poor a recipient smelled like entrapment or insult. Too intimate a token too early made neighbors shake heads. Return a token if you must end a betrothal. Keep it if you want people to suspect drama. In disputes heard before local or ecclesiastical courts, objects stood up to testify. A clerk would lay a ring on a board and ask questions none of us want jewelry to answer. On what day did he give you this? Who witnessed? Occasionally, an entire future hinged on whether a glove had been meant as courtesy or pledge. The law dislikes romance, mostly because romance disrespects footnotes. Love notes lived in margins literally. Many a book of ours wears faint imprints of pressed flowers, a shadow of petals on vellum like old laughter. A careful reader might leave a thread marker 2 pages before a favorite psalm so that a second careful reader could find it by accident. On one page, a small bird face is left when early affection filled the room. Later, the same bird is retouched to face right, an artist's quiet confession that feeling like feathers can change direction. Risk rode alongside sweetness. A found letter could ruin a girl, cost a boy his place in a lord's service, end a marriage that deserved better than it began. That is why so much meaning was put into harmless things. Hold a spoon and you cannot be commanded to recite its text. Wear a ribbon and you can always say it was the only color left at market. Kiss a book, and none can tell whether you kiss the words or the wood cut beside them. Love learned plausible deniability because safety demanded it, and safety, let us admit it, kept second chances possible. We should step into 3 rooms briefly and listen. In the first, a low cottage, a girl spreads a clean cloth and sets down a borrowed psalter. She cannot read the Latin, but she can read the careful fold that someone he left between the canticles. Inside is a sliver of parchment with 4 words and a dot. The words are not bold. They are tidy. I will mend tomorrow. She smiles because tomorrow's hinge squeal will be silenced and because the sentence means more than hinges. In the second, a castle solar, a woman opens a small coffer of cypress wood and lifts a rosary of jet. It was her mother's, then hers, and now the beads click quietly. while she considers a note sealed in green wax. Her husband is away on the king's business. The letter is from his steward, loyal, precise. "We have repaired the north bridge you favored." She feels gratitude for the steward, respect for her absent spouse, and bother admiration for the artisan who carved the saint on the new parapet in a style she will not name aloud. She decides to fund a new lamp for the chapel in thanks. Some desires are safest when translated into light. In the third, a court hall, a young knight receives a ribbon from a lady whose gaze could discipline cavalry. She says, "For your courage in speaking truth to my brother, and every person within earshot hears, for not flattering power." He ties the token to his sleeve and thinks sternly of becoming worthy rather than becoming interesting. This is how the better stories begin, with the quiet decision to let a gift insist on virtue instead of conquest. Sometimes tokens misfired. A glove returned with the stitching unpicked, said more unkindly than any sentence. A ring sent back, with the motto scraped away, turned love into evidence for the prosecution. A letter that arrived sodden from rain and half illegible could betray without intending to. There is an entire minor genre of medieval misery that consists of people discoursing on the cruel indifference of weather to delicate feelings. Somewhere a poet, having lost a note in a ford, declared that rivers are skeptics. He was not wrong. And yet for every mischance, a dozen quiet successes of color spotted across a crowded church, a sprig of rosemary tucked into bread, a page turned down at the corner in a book passed from hand to hand until it came back to the right hand, a spoon in a chest preserved for 50 years, without anyone explaining why and no one needing to. Tokens did not merely communicate, they remembered. When memory faltered, as it does even to ardent hearts, objects steadied it. "We were this to each other once a ribbon can say from the dark. Perhaps we can be kind again." A final thought about secrecy. Because secrets have their own ethics, the best tokens allowed refusal. A ribbon can be returned. A letter can be burned unread. A spoon can be used by someone else, and the world does not end. The worst cornered the recipient with costliness or gossip. Medieval lovers, when they were wise, chose gifts that did not become traps. Love, without room to decline, is not love. It is leverage. The quiet triumph of the token is that it proposes, it does not impose. So tokens and letters, small rebellions in a supervised world. Each said, with more or fewer syllables, the same stubborn sentence, "I see you." Not the alliance you represent, not the acreages your father imagines, not the labor your hands will add to a hard year you. A glove could do that. So could a spoon. So often and bravely could a scrap of ink. And in the long patience between sending and reply, people learned the oldest art of love. There is waiting without bitterness, answering without haste, and letting the smallest things carry the heaviest meanings until, miracle of miracles, they did. The church and the chaperone police. If medieval romance had an uncredited co-author, it was the church, a tireless editor who crossed out entire paragraphs of pleasure and replaced them with notes in the margin that said decency and repent immediately. Love might begin with a glance, but before that glance could ripen into anything truly memorable, it had to survive a gauntlet of sermons, confessionals, and family members who believed surveillance was next to godliness. From the church's point of view, love was suspicious not because it was sinful, but because it was unpredictable. Sin could be scheduled and fined. Passion was volcanic. Priests preached that the only safe love was the kind written into a contract witnessed by God, and preferably chaperoned by a relative with poor hearing but strong opinions. Everything else, was the devil's rehearsal. The official line was, "Simple love is sacred inside marriage, and everything outside it is either temptation or paperwork in progress." Behind this doctrine lay centuries of administrative effort. By the 12th century, marriage had evolved from a social custom into a sacrament, and sacraments require paperwork. There were bans to announce 3 Sundays of public warning before vows could be exchanged, and long lists of forbidden degrees of kinship. The church measured bloodlines like a nervous genealogist, no cousin within 7 degrees, though the math was generous enough to turn a wedding into an act of advanced geometry. If 2 families ignored the rule, they could pay a fine-due penance or, in extremity, receive annulment and heartbreak in equal measure. In practice, the church's vigilance created an entire genre of low-risk disobedience. Lovers met in the gray zones, under porches and gardens, in the back rows of Mass, where kneeling covered a multitude of gestures. Parish priests knew what was happening and preferred not to know too precisely. They were overworked, underpaid, and aware that human nature has no off switch. A sensible curate could forgive anything that didn't interrupt Vespers. Chaperones, meanwhile, acted as the church's volunteer deputies. Their job description combined moral policing with theatrical direction. A noblewoman never walked alone if a cousin could be persuaded to accompany her. A village girl rarely fetched water without a younger sibling clinging to the bucket. If a conversation grew animated, the chaperone coughed. If laughter lingered too long, she rearranged the chairs. An ideal escort possessed the hearing of a saint and the imagination of a stone. Too vigilant, and she strangled the plot. Too lenient, and she became part of it. The church encouraged this culture of witnesses. Privacy was treated like suspicious silence in a confessional, not proof of guilt, but strong evidence of opportunity. A respectable couple's every meeting occurred under the collective gaze of parents, servants, neighbors, or heaven. The very architecture of courtship bent toward public view. Great halls replaced cozy corners. Gardens were formal, not secret. Letters passed through so many hands that even the ink felt nervous. Love might claim to be blind, but in medieval Europe it never lacked an audience. And yet, paradoxically, this omnipresent watchfulness gave birth to subtlety. Lovers learned the art of small signals because large ones were fatal. A touch of the sleeve during a dance, the exchange of a prayer request, the synchronization of visits to the market, these became the punctuation marks of forbidden syntax. In villages, flirtation evolved into a slow-motion dance of errands. In castles, it turned into a tournament of restraint, where a single smile could fill a winter. The church, intending to suppress desire, instead taught it patience and poetry. Sermons on chastity were a medieval spectator sport. Parishioners pretended shock. Preachers pretended ignorance of the chuckles they provoked. The pulpit thundered that flesh was frail, that kisses led to chaos, that modesty was armor. The subtext, as every married person in the room knew, was that passion within limits kept both households and confessions tidy. "Better to marry than to burn," thundered Street Paul, and half the congregation nodded, thinking mostly about firewood. Confession itself played a double role. Officially, it was spiritual hygiene. Unofficially, it was therapy with penalties attached. Lovers confessed too much or too little, depending on courage and the priest's patience. A sympathetic confessor could steer a couple from scandal to sanctioned vows. A strict one could ruin reputations with a raised eyebrow. Manuals for confessors multiplied, offering questions so delicate they read like gossip disguised as theology. How long was the embrace? Was it before or after the harvest? Did laughter accompany it? The church worried that priests might enjoy these interrogations, and so wrote more manuals. An early example of moral recursion. The other half of the chaperone system was family honor, which had its own theology. A daughter's virtue was a father's credit, a son's restraint, a mother's pride. Households guarded reputations with the same zeal they guarded door keys. A rumor could travel from tavern to altar before a rooster crowed twice. To avoid such disasters, families engineered encounters so public that the Virgin herself would have blushed from the noise. The result was a society where intimacy required choreography, and romance was a team sport. For the upper classes, the Church's gaze extended to the writing desk. Courtly correspondence was censored by piety. A knight's letter began with an invocation of the Trinity, before descending into verses about eyes like candles and souls like storm-tossed ships. The opening line, "To my lady for whom I pray nightly," served as both devotion and insurance policy. Should the letter fall into the wrong hands, it could be defended as an overly emotional sermon. Scribes and couriers learned discretion the way falcons learned silence by threat and example. In smaller parishes, enforcement was less theatrical and more exhausting. Local priests mediated disputes over betrothals gone wrong, weighed whether a promise whispered in a barn counted as binding, and fielded questions like, "If we hold hands after the banns are read, does that mean we are married?" The answer, delivered with the weary humor of experience, was usually, "Not yet, and please keep it that way." Parish registers record both joy and bureaucracy. A ceremony here, a fine there. A note that two young people were admonished, gently clerical shorthand, for caught again poor souls. Despite all this vigilance, or perhaps because of it, human creativity flourished. Lovers smuggled affection into liturgy, choosing the same patron saint, lighting candles in matched pairs, timing confessions to coincide. A festival of Corpus Christi might double as a festival of glances. The Church had built a labyrinth of propriety. The faithful, being inventive mice, learned every tunnel. Still, the clergy could surprise. Some monks wrote treatises praising marital affection as a reflection of divine love. Others thundered that even married couples should approach the bedchamber as penitents entering a cell. Between these extremes lived the practical parish priest who knew that too much guilt spoiled productivity. His advice was simple: work hard, pray often, keep peace at home, and remember that laughter, though not listed among the sacraments, was occasionally permitted. Chaperones, meanwhile, evolved into an institution so entrenched that even heaven must have sighed. A proper household required at least one, an aunt, a nurse, or a friend, whose virtue was indestructible and whose hobby was attendance. They were living surveillance systems powered by gossip instead of electricity. Their presence at picnics and pilgrimages ensured that conversation never exceeded the temperature of porridge. Young people invented countermeasures, decoy walks, elaborate group outings, and the strategic use of crowds. A procession to a local shrine could conceal more flirtations than the entire archives of troubadour poetry. But not all chaperones were villains. Some were secret allies tired of pretending youth was tidy. An indulgent aunt might cough loudly enough to warn, but softly enough to excuse. A nun supervising novices might look away for precisely the length of one exchanged smile. They understood what the Church sometimes forgot, that virtue without mercy becomes cruelty, and cruelty has no staying power. The irony, delicious in hindsight, is that the Church's machinery of control preserved the very romance it feared. Because intimacy was difficult, it became valuable. Because meetings were rare, they became sacred. Because temptation was dangerous, it learned eloquence. The barriers transformed ordinary attraction into something stylized, deliberate, and memorable. Without bishops and bands, there would have been no troubadours. Without chaperones, no letters folded like prayers. By the late Middle Ages, reformers began to complain that the laity had grown too worldly in love, that confessions sounded more like songs than sins. The church answered with stricter rules and softer homilies, sensing that what could not be eradicated might be guided. Marriage manuals urged mutual respect. Sermons celebrated companionship. Saints were invoked as patrons of fidelity rather than enemies of pleasure. Slowly, the institution that once guarded hearts with iron learned to cradle them with doctrine instead. And the chaperone, she endured well into modern centuries, a relic of divine bureaucracy. Long after the Latin faded and the band shortened, someone still cleared a throat in the background of every new affection. It is possible that the habit lives on today in the polite questions of relatives in the comment sections of social media, echoes of medieval supervision humming quietly in our bones. So the church's stern architect of morality and the chaperone, its mortal handmaiden, deserve a curious kind of credit. They kept love inconvenient, and by keeping it inconvenient, they kept it alive. For nothing in history has ever burned brighter than a flame protected by too much wind and yet somehow refusing to go out. Festivals and flirting markets, maypoles, and the courage of ale. If chaperones were the locks on the door, festivals were the polite church-approved windows left open for fresh air. The calendar scattered opportunities for supervised mischief across the year, like breadcrumbs, fairs and fasts, vigils and feasts, processions that moved too slowly for virtue and too quickly for supervision. Love didn't need privacy. It needed pretext. Festivals provided it in abundance, music loud enough to make whispers look innocent crowds, thick enough to confuse an ant, and rituals so ancient that even the local priest could only shrug and say, "As our fathers did." Spring began the season of bravery. At Maytide, the village tied ribbons to anything that would hold still: poles, hawthorn, hats, opinions, garlands, crowned girls who pretended not to enjoy it. Boys pretended they were only here for the music and then tripped over their own certainty. Dancing, organized, touching into geometry, rings and reels, where hands met and parted by rule, which made rules surprisingly popular. The maypole itself, where it existed, rose like a very tall excuse. Ribbons crossed and recrossed. Feet kept time. Eyes handled the important business. If you needed to send a message, you tugged a ribbon with exactly the pressure of a sentence you dared not speak. No one could object after all. The village was only celebrating spring so vigorously the hay blushed. Midsummer traded flowers for fire. Street John's bonfires turned lanes into amber tunnels and made everyone look better than they had at noon. Leaping flames ostensibly for luck tested ankles and courage. A steady hand helping you across was practically a vow with sparks. Herbal bundles smoldered and so did patience. If May asked, "Who are you?" Midsummer asked, "Are you brave? Brave enough to share a cup to walk home the long way to say, 'See you Sunday,' in a tone that promised there would indeed be a Sunday." Markets and fairs were the everyday festival's permission slips signed by necessity. Cheese, wool, gossip, all the essentials gathered on market day, and so did hearts. The chatter alone performed matchmaking prices, debated tools, admired reputations measured by how many people nodded when your name was spoken. Traveling minstrels tuned their instruments, while merchants tuned their lies. And between the two young people discovered that conversation is easier when 3 other conversations drown your blush. A new belt, a better knife, yes. Also that ribbon. That means nothing, obviously, unless it fits your sleeve suspiciously well. Church ales fundraisers with taps reminded everyone that piety, when properly poured, could be merry. Ale sold for a roof repair lubricated forgiveness. a quarrel eased by a bench, and a song ended with hands closer than doctrine preferred. The priest approved because the nave would be dry this winter. The reeve approved because the village was. Someone produced a drum. Someone else produced a story. Couples produced plausible reasons to fetch more bread together. If the chaperone asked where you'd been, you could answer truthfully, supporting the parish. Mystery plays rolled through towns like a moving sermon with a sense of humor. Guilds wheeled pageant wagons from scene to scene, creation at one corner, Noah scolding a tipsy audience at the next, and the crowd followed holiness at a comfortable pace. Watching together created a little democracy of attention, nobles and bakers laughing at the same devil with the same ridiculous tale. During scene changes, a young man could recommend a better viewing spot for edification, and a young woman could discover that his theology improved dramatically when he stood downwind of the pie stall. Plays taught doctrine. They also taught that standing shoulder to shoulder makes strangers feel like possibilities. Pilgrimages widened the map of opportunity. A group set out to a shrine with bedrolls bread and superior intentions. On the road, status blurred. Dust did what sermons tried to. Stories swapped like provisions. Feet learned each other's rhythms. Chaperones discovered that even vigilance needs sleep. Saints collected prayers and occasionally engagements. You returned home with a token from a holy well and a new calm about who had walked beside you between the hedges when the evening smelled of thyme. Local customs added spice by parish. In some places, Shrovetide unfastened belts and inhibitions, notch games in the lanes mock battles that made real bruises and unreal declarations. In others, Hocktide arrived with ransom games, where men and women took turns capturing each other for charity, and jokes the whole thing supervised by elders who pretended to disapprove while counting coin. Harvest homes wrapped gratitude in noise. The last sheaf, the Kern baby or some cousin of her, came in to applause. Ale argued with song. Couples slipped out to check whether stars still existed. They did, and kindly. Urban life supplied different stages. Bathhouses, where they existed and were still respectable, were social more than sensual. A place to steam winter out of bones and discuss who had married unwisely. Bridges and riversides hosted vendors by day and lingerers by evening. If you could hold your place against the tide of carts and dogs, you could hold a conversation. Guild feasts and apprentices' holidays turned workplaces into theaters. Nothing accelerates attraction like seeing someone handle a carving knife with the confidence of a saint, especially when they leave you the best slice with a generosity that cannot be entirely professional. Music threaded all these gatherings together, pipes and fiddles, drums and voices big enough to make rafters consider their sins. You didn't need an instrument to participate. You needed breath and the courage to be tuneful in public. Songs carried refrains. Everyone knew which meant you could harmonize with someone whose name you hadn't learned yet and decide afterward whether to. Dances set manners to rhythm. A bow at the beginning said, "I won't embarrass you." A bow at the end said, "I would like to try again." In between wrists and shoulders learned more about each other than sermons considered polite. Clothes played accomplice. Festival linen was whiter. Sunday best smelled faintly of lavender, if fortune allowed. Laces tied just snug enough to suggest that the wearer had opinions. Tokens from earlier chapters reappeared with plausible innocence. That glove, it went with the gown. That ribbon, it was the only one at market that didn't clash with shame. Flowers, of course, did half the talking pinned, where chaperones could approve and sweethearts could decode. Supervision tried to keep pace. Aunts traveled in flocks. Uncles cultivated the art of lurking. But crowds are generous to the young. A cough covered a sentence. A turned back offered a moment. A transaction at a stall created a pocket of privacy the size of 2 apples and a future. Besides, even chaperones are human. A pie must be sampled. A hymn must be sung. The bonfire must be admired at exactly the same moment as everyone else. Love didn't need a door to swing shut. It needed 10 seconds and a reason to exist when it opened again. Not that festivals removed risk. A misread glance could sour a season. A dance too close could be noticed by the wrong cousin and recounted with improvements. Drink could loosen tongues past usefulness. The cure for such disasters was the village's long memory for kindness and short patience for fools. If you blundered, you apologized. If you boasted, you stopped. If you erred, you volunteered the next morning to haul water for the old and stiff. Reputation was repairable work like thatch. And because we promised humor, yes, festivals produced the confident amateur poet, a threat to peace, second only to the officious usher. He declaimed verse about eyes like lakes until the actual lake in question felt misrepresented. He rhymed heart with part and expected gratitude. Villages developed elegant defenses, sudden interest in the weather, urgent need to check on the bread, or spontaneous group singing at volumes that made metaphor retreat. The lesson was clear: if you intend poetry, bring bread too. What festivals made more than matches was momentum. A conversation begun at May could survive to Michaelmas on the strength of ritual alone, see each other at market, sing on Sundays, exchange tokens under the discipline of the calendar. The year itself conspired to keep you brave. Advent's candles for patience, Christmas's greenery for endurance, Candlemas for light in bleakness, Lent to remind you that restraint is not only for lovers, Easter to prove that morning return. The church had set these feasts to teach theology. Couples without blasphemy learned love with the same lessons. By year's end, some flirtations cooled into fondness that nodded across pews. Others warmed into bands called aloud 3 Sundays of names hung in the nave like garlands. Either way, the festivals had done honest labor. They'd turned opportunity into character and attraction into habit. They'd given 2 people 100 small chances to be kind under observation, which is the only test that matters since most of married life is performed in front of witnesses named neighbors. So when we picture medieval flirting, let's not isolate the stolen glance. Let's see the whole choreography, the saint's day that put everyone in the same field, the market that made errands rhyme with meetings, the bonfire that turned timidity gold. Love prospered because the calendar insisted on hope and the village insisted on music. Tomorrow we will return to kitchens and councils, to ledgers and laws. But for tonight, let the drum keep time and the garlands keep secrets. And when the fire sinks to a red patience, walk home together the long way, 2 silhouettes on a lane that remembers every festival and every promise it ever hosted. Marriage disappointment and second chances. The wedding is the loudest day. Marriage is everything after the musicians go home. The garlands dry, the ale settles into stories. The bed creaks for more reasons than 1 and 2 people wake to discover that happily ever after begins at dawn with a draft from the door and someone's boots in the wrong place. If courtship was ceremony and code marriage is practice awkward, repeated, refined, it breaks nothing as spectacularly as a tournament and repairs more than any treaty. It asks for patience in small coins paid daily. Disappointment arrives first, not because love fails, but because expectations do. The mind builds palaces, bodies live in cottages. He imagined an angel at his fire. He got a woman with opinions about brooms. She imagined a night of endless competence. She got a man who argues with hinges. This is not tragedy. It is recognition. Under vow and roof, people begin the slow trade of illusions for truths, how often he needs silence, how she saves string, which tasks each will do without being asked. The ledger from part 1 comes back, but now the entries are intimate, time, temper, tenderness. Money dares to be honest after a wedding. In peasant huts, coins are rumors, not residents. Everything runs on barter and sweat. In manor halls, accounts thicken like stew, and someone learns that wheat does not obey heraldry. Dowry becomes linen pots, a cow. Dower, the widow's portion, is a promise carved into law and sometimes carved away by unscrupulous uncles. Tools break, roofs leak, the child needs shoes. Romance is not defeated by these facts. It is revealed by them. A husband who appears with a mended rake is reciting a vow in a dialect more useful than Latin. A wife who budgets winter into spring is composing a love poem with numbers. Intimacy is both simpler and more puzzling than poems promised. The church calls it the marital debt, a phrase that manages to sound both reverent and like something a reeve collects while clearing his throat. Between two people, the language is kinder, touch, reassurance, warmth. Desire fluctuates with seasons, with exhaustion, with the calendar's long pockets of abstinence that preachers recommend and the married negotiate. Advent and Lent, vigils, feast eves. If you kept every prohibition, you might never speak to each other without apologizing. Most couples aim instead at decency and mercy. Be faithful, be gentle, and forgive the days when kindness is sleepy. Children complicate the equation by becoming the point of it. Pregnancy interrupts sleep, rearranges tempers, and turns fear into a nightly guest. Birth is a threshold patrolled by saints and midwives. Sometimes mother and child walk through together, sometimes not, and grief becomes the third partner for a while. The high die in childbed as surely as the low. Stone cannot bribe blood. Marriage in such a world learns humility quickly. It learns to count joys immediately because delay is dangerous. It learns that love after loss is quieter but deeper, like a river in winter. Less sparkle, more strength. Quarrels arrive as predictably as Sundays. Good couples learn how to disagree without audience. Bad couples invite the village and serve snacks. The subjects are eternal money, in-laws. Whether gossip can be ignored by willpower alone, it cannot. Where the pitchfork belongs. How loudly he should sing, how loudly she should not. The cures are homely apology bread, a walk, the decision to let one small, stupid thing stay small and stupid. The cruelest sentence in any marriage is, you always followed closely by, you never. The kindest is, all right. Craftsmen say a house stands where the mortar is flexible. Marriages are much the same. Violence, let us not look away, lived in some houses. Communities responded with the tools they had. Charivari and Skimmington rides, pots banged at midnight. Shame paraded under the pretense of joke. Justice in these moments was noisy and not always just. It announced imperfectly that the household is not a miniature kingdom with a tyrant on the chair. Where priests were brave, they intervened. Where they were weary, they sighed. Where they were cowardly, they cited patience and looked at the floor. Even so, the arc of counsel in the later Middle Ages bent, if slowly, toward mutual regard, manuals advising husbands to love, not merely rule, and wives to be partners, not property. Among nobles, disappointment wore velvet but pinched the same. An alliance crafted in court turned into two people at breakfast. He traveled, she managed. Letters bridged the dignity gap with news of accounts and weather. A code for affection. How is your cough, we repaired. The bridge, the orchard thrives. Some unions thawed into companionship. He discovered she could run estates better than his steward. She discovered he could be kind with dogs and therefore might be kind with children. Others calcified into courtesy, a duet played flawlessly without warmth. In both cases, fidelity was negotiated between conscience and rumor. Even rumor appreciates competence, and a well-run household could silence ballads faster than a dagger. Annulment remained rare, costly, and theological consanguinity, coercion, impotence, the sorts of technicalities that send clerks into rapture and lovers into exile. Most marriages endured not because endurance was ideal, but because alternatives were worse. Separation from bed and board existed where cruelty or danger made cohabitation unsafe. It solved less than it relieved. The miracle, when it came in habit too. People who did not choose each other learning day by day to choose each other anyway. And then there is widowhood, the harshest teacher and the most efficient redistributor of plans. Death rarely sent invitations in advance. A cart rolled, a fever climbed, a blade slipped, a birth went crooked. Suddenly, one person became two roles. The widow took her dower if the law behaved, and the in-laws did not misbehave. She kept hens, debts, and a thin privacy that felt like both freedom and cold. The widower fed children badly for a month, and then accepted help or married quickly, and suffered a charivari for indecent haste. The village understands speed differently when small mouths are counting your decisions. Second marriages were not merely practical. They were laboratories for late tenderness. A woman who had learned her own competence in grief met a man chastened by it. They approached each other without trumpets. Expectations lowered by experience allowed affection to rise with fewer obstacles. He admired that she kept accounts like prayers. She admired that he listened without performing cleverness. Stepchildren complicated and enriched the story, adding layers of loyalty like palimpsest pages, a name written over a name both legible if you tilt the book to the light. Families formed that no poet would choose for a plot, and that any parish would choose for advice. Sex so noisy in sermons often quieted into comfort in these later matches. There is a kind of love that begins where spectacle ends, holding a hand through a fever, not minding a limp, inventing small economies of gratitude, your cup filled first, your place by the fire kept even when you are late. The body ages. The marriage discovers that tenderness is the only cure for time we've ever found that is not superstition. Work remains the frame. In peasant houses, winter tests, everything roof reserves patience. Married love passes or fails with the kindling who rises first, who coaxes a flame, who pretends not to notice failures because shame is poor fuel. In castles, politics blow through halls like drafts. A couple survives by standing together in doorways when the wind comes. In towns, guild rules and rents press. Spouses share strategy the way they share tools. The most romantic sentence in any medieval city might be, "I balanced the books." The second is, "I sold the extra cloth." The third whispered, "I left the good piece because I knew you wanted it." Jealousy visits as faithfully as the tax collector. Remedies improve with age, a joke, a prayer, the deliberate choice to trust, the stricter choice not to test. For those trapped in courtly geometries, longing learns to cooperate with loyalty. For those content with ordinary rooms, loyalty deepens by noticing, truly noticing what the other person carries that day. Grief, pried the thorn of some silly insult that pierced deeper than it should. You remove thorns with patience, not needles. Old age, for the few who reach it together, is a long conversation with interruptions for soup, legs ache, memory edits. Grandchildren repopulate the lanes with proof that someone somewhere managed what you attempted. The jokes from youth are told again, trimmed of malice and fat. The house which once felt too small for temper now feels exactly right for 2 chairs and a cat. When one dies first, the other tends the absence as if it were a garden. Objects receive promotion: his spoon, her shawl, the stool. With one stubborn wobble, no one was allowed to fix because it had become a family story. If all this sounds earnest, keep your smile. Marriage needs it. For even in disappointment there is comedy. The noble lord who finally admits his wife can read accounts faster than he can read Latin titles. The peasant wife who discovers her husband has been secretly bribing the cat with bits of cheese after swearing they had none to spare. The couple who spend a decade debating whether the door should open inward or outward and resolve the matter by moving the stool. Laughter does not trivialize difficulty. It makes it bearable. The church didn't name it a sacrament, but perhaps it should have. Second chances, finally, are not only the prerogative of widows and widowers. They occur inside marriages that refuse to end where they began. After a bad year, a harsh word, an illness, a slow repair, people decide again. They re-court under their own roof. He learns a new tenderness because the old one failed. She accepts a new apology because the old one was unworthy. They trade a little pride for a lot of peace. They light a candle not for spectacle, but for seeing each other's faces clearly at last. So disappointment is not the opposite of love. It is the tutor of it. It removes costumes and leaves human beings who must decide whether to be kind. And second chances are not consolation prizes. They are the true victories, quiet, unmarketed, celebrated in kitchens. If courtship taught our medieval lovers to speak, marriage teaches them to listen. If courtly love perfected the art of longing, marriage perfects the art of staying. And in staying, they discover the only romance that never bores history: 2 people who learn against the odds and with witnesses to keep each other warm. So here we are at the edge of the village and the end of our wandering, with the maypole ribbons tucked away the tournament field quiet and the letters folded back into their books. We've walked the muddy lanes of peasant courtship where kindness wore work clothes, climbed the marble stairs of noble alliances where love learned to breathe between parchments, listened to the courteous ache of courtly longing, felt the weight of tokens and the hush of wax seals, threaded the labyrinth of bands and chaperones, laughed beneath festival garlands, and sat by late fires with marriages that learned the art of staying. What did the Middle Ages finally teach us about dating? That the heart is practical and the ledger can be tender. That romance survives inside rules by learning patience. That small mercies count larger than grand speeches. That second chances are the secret saints of ordinary houses. If you need an emblem to carry home, take 2, a ledger and a lamp. The ledger keeps the household honest. Who brings bread, who brings temper, who brings laughter when wood is low. The lamp makes that honesty warm, turning duty into gentleness and habit into love. Together they outlast weather, rumor, and the long season between harvests. We are not so different now. Our chapels have become phone screens, our chaperones live in comment sections, our tokens fit in pockets as messages that travel faster than horses. But the grammar remains: be useful, be kind, keep trust, and let the smallest true things speak when the largest words fail. If someone mends a hinge for you, remember it. If someone leaves you the warmer side of the bed, praise them as if they had conquered a kingdom. If you love, say so in deeds. If you cannot return the ribbon uncut. And if disappointment arrives, as it does, even to the best lit rooms, do not mistake it for the end of the story. It is often the tutor of a better chapter. Thank you for walking with me through this long, tender territory of medieval life, through mud and music, through parchment and poetry, through laughter that made winter tolerable and vows that made summer honest. If this quiet journey helped you rest, warmed a corner of your night, or gave you a new way to see an old world, I'm glad. Before we part, would you do 3 gentle things? Like this. If it soothed you, subscribe to keep the candle lit for our next wander. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and which part of medieval love you carried away. A spoon, a ribbon, a line of ink, a small brave. All right, now dim the room, let the last ash settle and breathe. The bell is far, the road is safe, and morning will find you kindly. Until then, from Gentle Historian, Medieval Life, good night.